Hello again. After talking about afrocentrism this morning, a couple of people have ticked me off for allegedly ignoring civilizations in Africa which seemingly emerged spontaneously and were not a product of colonialism. I have dealt with this subject before, but it seems that some people were unaware of this. Let me briefly examine these claims by running through three of the cultures to which my attention is directed from time to time. It is perfectly true that Zimbabwe was the home of an indigenous sub-Saharan culture, which arose without any external influences upon it. Unfortunately, this so-called civilization achieved nothing at all of any note.
It is not true that this civilization achieved nothing. They fashioned gold, had great art. They're even known to paint, but since they painted their bodies instead of painting on canvases, those have been lost to us. But we know from writings written by Arabs and Portuguese traders who came to the region that this civilization was actually a very fascinating one. In fact, there's writing on the top of the Zimbabwe plateau where two Arabs who got there said they didn't recognize the writing that was written at the top of the Zimbabwe sculpture structure. But given this does not mean that that was actually writing or not writing, but these Arabs said that the natives read the writing and they did not recognize the letters of the writing. They called it writing. Here's, as we read here, the first Europeans' visit may have been made by the Portuguese travelers Antonio Fernandes in 1513 to 1515, who crossed twice and reported in detail the region of present-day Zimbabwe, including the Shona kingdoms, and also fortified centers in stone without mortar. However, passing en route a few kilometers north of the about 56 kilometers south of the site, he did not make a reference to Great Zimbabwe. Portuguese traders heard about the remains of medieval city in early 16th century, and records survive of interviews and notes made by some of them, linking Great Zimbabwe to gold production and long-distance trade. Two of those accounts mention an inscription above the entrance to Great Zimbabwe written in characters not known to the Arab merchants who had seen it. Okay, so this is some script that was written above the entrance, which probably indicates what the entrance was for. And they said that this writing was unknown to the Arabs, meaning that it was foreign to the Arabs. But that is irrelevant because there's other African areas like Zambia that had Lusona, which is an ideographic tradition of writing that represents mathematics and stuff like that. Not to mention that there's a Dinkra, there's the Meroitic script, there's Tifnug, there's Ge'ez, there's Nsibidi, there's a Dinkra. There's all kinds of writing systems that existed in the 1500s. Even the Luo script, whatever you want. There's scripts all over Africa, but more than this, we can talk about Arabic existed at this time. There were foreign forms of writing in Africa that were being used at this time, so it's not safe or even right to say that there were no scripts in Africa. There was a lot, actually. There was a lot of scripts that were used for writing. And most egregious of all is that most of the writing that comes from Europe was invented in the Middle East and then transported and rethought up in Greece and in other places, and then it was transported to Britain. We know that Britain didn't have writing for a long time until the Romans gave them, and those Romans took the script from earlier Mesopotamian tribes and stuff like that. So
At the time that magnificent buildings such as Salisbury Cathedral in England and Notre Dame in Paris were being erected, Europe was full of people who could read and write, and the Renaissance was about to flower. We know this because we can see the buildings from that time and also read the poetry which was being written, and the philosophy, and science, and mathematics. We can look at the paintings and sculptures which are the product of European civilization in the Middle Ages, round about 1200, 1300 and so on. In southern Africa, in what is now the country of Zimbabwe, there were at that time, the Middle Ages, a tribe of people living in grass huts. These people produced no books, they were all illiterate, having no written language. They practiced agriculture, and their most sophisticated tools were the plough and the spear.
I think I've provided enough evidence so far to show that Africa had multiple civilizations that had stuff that was more important than the plow and the spear. Obviously, all over Africa at this point. You know, the funny part is in the 1500s, the Portuguese took over Mozambique. So for him to say there were no books in Africa, it means that he's also ignorant of European history. Like, there was literally Europeans in Africa in the 1500s. And they brought books, they built buildings. There was literally Arabs in Africa who built giant buildings. Not to mention, isn't there like pyramids that predate all that crap, like literally by thousands of years?
No mathematics, no science, no philosophy. What they did manage to do was build some dry stone walls, the kind of thing which in Europe were being erected in the Bronze Age. The thumbnail to this video shows some of these walls. This was the absolute peak of indigenous culture in sub-Saharan Africa in the Middle Ages, and indeed up until the time of the arrival of English colonists in the 19th century.
Again, this guy is just showing his ignorance. Africa had Europeans, it had Arabs, it had Moors, it had black Africans, and it had all kinds of people who created civilizations with all kinds of different roots. There's even Europeans who wrote about how some people from the Congo used rubber before Leopold got there. But let's ignore that for 1 second and talk about one thing that he talked about, which is the natives of Africa not having civilizations. Well, what about literally the biggest stone walls in West Africa? Literally the biggest stone walls in the world were in Africa. What about the Kingdom of Congo and all their stone walls? What about Great Zimbabwe and all their stone walls? You keep saying dry stone wall. It's like so lame. And of course, you want to talk about who did it first? What about the Kingdom of Nubia, Kingdom of Kush? This is like thousands of years ago, thousands of years before most of the stuff done in Europe. What about Egypt?
That was it, some dry stone walling. I've spoken before about the kingdom of Axum in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea. This was certainly an impressive civilization, and it was indubitably in Africa. It had a written script, an awful lot was going on in the Axumite civilization. It wasn't really an African culture, though. I know this without the slightest shadow of a doubt because I can actually understand some Tigrinya and Amharic, which are languages spoken in this part of Africa. I might mention that I have, after making a previous video on this subject, been contacted by a couple of Tigrinya-speaking Africans who thanked me for what they thought was a fair account of their culture and the history of their civilization. About 4,000 years.
The mixed population of Axum does not make the Axumite Empire non-African. In fact, it's a very African civilization. This is like saying that Greece cannot be a Greek civilization because when Greece took over Asia and it took over Africa, those aren't Greeks, those are Africans, those are Arabs. Therefore, that wasn't Greek, and I can understand Arabic. Therefore, they speak Arabic. It's not an Arabic civilization. It's not a Greek civilization. It's Arabic. When the Greeks took over other parts of the world, when the British took over Africa, the parts where they speak Africa can't be an African, can't be a European colonization because they speak a different language. This is silly. Also, just because there's a mixed population doesn't mean that it's not African. Most of the people who lived under the Axumite Empire were black Africans.
Years ago, Semites from what is now Saudi Arabia and Yemen crossed the Red Sea and colonised what is today Ethiopia. They brought with them their language, which is of course related to Hebrew and Arabic. There were later waves of colonists to establish a kingdom called Axum in Ethiopia, partly in Ethiopia, partly in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. This is why Ethiopia, unlike other African countries, has an ancient writing system which is based upon Proto-Arabic. The African
And the European script was based around the Phoenician script. So therefore, they were taking from the Middle East. The Middle East went everywhere, and they gave some scripts to different people. This does not mean that those places don't have original ideas. If you take this tact with Africa, you have to take it with Europe as well and say, okay, well, most of the stuff that we have done in Europe is because of the Middle East. And you will see further evidence of this.
languages in that country, things like Oromo, are regarded as low status to this very day. Amharic is high status because it was a language of the elite, the colonial administration, if you like. This is how I can recognise some words in both Amharic and Tigrinya, because I speak Hebrew. Axum was not an African civilization, but a Semitic one.
This point is stupid on all counts. I mean, didn't the Semitic people take over parts of Eastern Europe? Didn't they also give a lot of their inventions over to the Eastern Europeans that then propagated into Europe, like farming? Does this mean that Europe has never invented anything ever? Didn't the Golden Age of Islam give birth to the Renaissance? Didn't Isaac Newton cite Islamic scholars for his book of optics, copying another book of optics done by an Islamic scholar who also had a book named Kitab, which means book of optics?
Mali, about which people also boast as having been a centre for learning and having the oldest university in the world and various other ridiculous things, was a collection of mud buildings until the French colonial administration showed the people there how to build things with more than one story.
Yeah, he's got multiple lines crossed here. He's talking about building buildings, which, as I'm showing the walls, they clearly did that, and they did that a lot. But then he's also mixing up building multiple stories, which, by the way, like building multiple stories existed in Ethiopia and existed other places. It's not a purely European invention. I mean, even Asia had a lot of these ideas. But I understand why he's saying what he's saying. He kind of has to.
It is true that there was a mosque there, built of mud, and also that Arab traders and Tuareg stayed there at times. All the culture of Mali, though, was created not by black sub-Saharan Africans, but rather by the Berbers and the Arabs. The Tuareg are a Berber people, by the way. This is why Mali did not become important until 600 years after the Arab conquest of North Africa. It took that long for Arab culture to permeate south into Africa. The Berbers and Arabs went to Mali, and that is why all the documents from that time are written in the Arabic script, There was no writing in Africa before Semites went there and taught the people living there how to write. That's what happened in Mali, and it's also what happened in Ethiopia. I'm sorry to pour cold water on the claims of great African civilizations in the past before the coming of colonial powers of either Semitic or European origin, but there it is. In sub-Saharan Africa, there was no writing, no buildings with upper stories, no wills, no machinery, no roads. All these things only appeared once Arabs, French, and English administrations introduced them. Left to their own devices, those living in Africa below the equator didn't come up with any of these ideas.
I love how he keeps repeating the same point over and over again. No writing, no reading, over and over again. I was going to debunk the whole video, but then I realized he just keeps repeating the same stuff. And that's because he has nothing else. So he has to rely on those three, thinking that he's got them down. He doesn't want to mention anything else because it's highly possible that they existed in that area. And I love that he switches to sub-Saharan African, which is a trick, because if he said African, then you can quickly point to even more ancient ones than Europeans, like Egypt, like Nubia, like basically all the civilizations that existed in the regions of North Africa. But he has to say sub-Saharan Africa because this is a trick. It's a trick in the same way that if I said Western Greco-Roman civilization in Europe was undeveloped until the Greeks came in. It's like, why are you isolating out the parts that had some of the best developments? Why are you picking that part out and then going, yeah, if you look west of the Greco-Roman civilization, you don't find writing for a long time. You don't find... Why are we doing this?